احنا لسه اولادي بيستنوا فيا، قلت حيفرحوا لما يشوفوني. احنا 6 نفار وابني الصغير من الصبح ما اكلش، هاي اللي خلاني اطلع وجوزي مريض قلب ومصاب.
أنا جاي من على الموت هنا عشان آخذ حبة طحين، بطالب في كل العالم في كل الدول إنها توقف الدم علينا بس شوي معي، لأنه إحنا اليوم أنا مبتور. اليوم أنا إذا ما أخذتش من هذا الطحن أنا بموت من الجوع. بطالب في كل المؤسسات إنها تقف لنا بس تطلع لنا بالنظرة، إنه إحنا بنموت قاعدين عشان ناخذ كيلو طحين.
ايش مالك ابراهيم؟
Marjorie Taylor Greene has said that what is occurring there is a genocide. Do you agree?
Oh, it's terrible what's occurring there, yeah. It's a terrible thing. People are very hungry. You know, the United States gave $60 million for food, and it's a shame because nobody, I don't see the results of it, and we gave it to people that in theory are watching over it fairly closely. We wanted Israel to watch over it. Part of the problem is Hamas is taking the money and they're taking the food. But we gave $60 million a couple of weeks ago. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody said thank you, but I didn't need the thank you. I just wanted the people to get fed, and we're helping out financially with that situation. It's a terrible situation. So just to conclude, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank you for being here.
Are you at the point yet where you would call what's happening in Gaza a genocide?
You can use whatever word you want.
But Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying that she's the first Republican to go there.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Look, genocide is a legal term. What is going on now clearly is absolutely horrific. 60,000 people dead and 140,000 who have been wounded. But the important point is not what you call it. It is horror. And I think the whole world knows that. The answer is, what the hell do we do about it? Should the United States taxpayer, should your taxpayer dollars go to support a government that is doing it? That is the most important issue. So immediately, you got to get ceasefire, you got to get humanitarian aid in, but the United States cannot continue to aid and abet the Netanyahu government doing what it's doing.
Do you want to see United States personnel on the ground helping distribute aid? I mean, what is another scenario here, do you think?
The United Nations has done, under very difficult circumstances, a good job until they were kicked out by Netanyahu. So I would like to bring them back, and I think they're prepared to come back.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to the 16th episode of Cold War 2.0 with our dear friend, Tarik Cyril Amar. Tarik, how are you doing, my friend, today?
I'm fine. How are you, Kevork?
I'm good. I wanted to start this conversation today with these videos. At the beginning, some of the footage from the Gaza Strip. Those are raw footage coming from Gaza. Then we had the comments made by Donald Trump, which he echoes many of the voices in this so-called populist right-wing scene. It's all about money. We have given them enough money. Let the neighbors take care of them. And I gave them 60 million and nobody said thank you to me, as if this is about money. And then you have someone like Bernie Sanders, who many people in the US and abroad have seen the light in the darkness of the American political scene, let's say. And it turned out to be that he was a controlled opposition in the Democratic Party, to the extent that he doesn't want to call whatever happening in Gaza a genocide because he thinks this is a legal term. And he did some word salad, basically, when we watched this, and he made it about Benjamin Netanyahu. This is all Benjamin Netanyahu's fault. This is not about the political system in Israel itself. But I found it fascinating that in the US there is this debate nowadays about what's going on in Gaza, and someone like, and I always butcher her name, Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. She became the first congressional Republican to use the word genocide to refer to Israel's actions in Gaza this Monday. And this was followed by another member of the Georgia delegation from the Democratic Party. She says, it is the most truthful and easiest thing to say that October 7 in Israel was horrific and all hostages must be returned, but so is the genocide, humanitarian crisis, and starvation happening in Gaza. The Rome Republican, she posted this on her social media account. Now we have the death toll. The minimum is 60,000. It goes up to 450,000 casualty rate, according to independent researchers. And I could show this research later during our conversation. But how do you see this debate in the US itself about Gaza? We have people in the Republican Party, let's say, arguing for a genocide. Tucker Carlson. We have Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then we have someone like in the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders, who people have had lots of hopes in him, that finally a left-wing voice coming in the Democratic Party who could find an alternative path to the neocon approach of the Democratic Party, but he turned out to be just like another Democrat in the United States. I would like to hear your thoughts about this debate going on in the US, especially when it comes to Gaza.
Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is that it's better that there finally is such a debate or such a discussion maybe than what we had before, because it was entirely suppressed, right?
Yes.
And now at least the issue of genocide has become so urgent that it has, as it were, invaded the political sphere of the United States in spite of all the repression that was launched against it, right? So, but then if you look at what happens in this discussion, then of course it very quickly turns very disappointing again, right? I mean, obviously the people who name this genocide as a genocide, I can only support that, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene is about as far politically away from me as I can imagine, and probably vice versa if she knew about me.
Yes.
But you know, she's closer to me there than Bernie Sanders, much closer, because she is actually, for whatever reasons, she is speaking a truth that Sanders still doesn't want to acknowledge. And that's important. Opposite to what Sanders is trying to say or to insinuate, it's actually very important what we call this. You know, this slimy argument that, oh yeah, it's terrible, but we don't have to talk about the word we use, right? That is actually extremely insidious, because Sanders must know, he's not that stupid, he must know that using the term actually has consequences. For instance, very simply, when you acknowledge a genocide officially, then you have officially acknowledged that you have a duty to act.
Yes.
This is why, for instance, the Clinton administration, and we know this very well by now, was repressing the notion of genocide as good as it could when the Rwanda genocide was happening. That's exactly the game they were playing. Call it whatever you want, just not genocide. Because once we call it genocide, we would have to acknowledge that we have obligations under international law to act against it. And Sanders knows this. Sanders knows this very well. So this whole argument that he's advancing here, that pragmatically, right, pragmatically hands-on, it doesn't matter what we call it, it's bullshit. It's bullshit, and it's extremely poisonous, toxic, deliberate bullshit. I hate the man. So here we are, we have Trump on the other side, right, who is still in complete denial, as is Sanders in his own way. And Trump is basically trying to twist the whole issue back. That's what he does in his answer here that we've played, to it's a humanitarian crisis, because that's how you talk, even if that's not appropriate also, about a humanitarian crisis. Oh, we're doing something, we're giving them money, right? And probably all of that is half true anyhow, not entirely true. But it is, of course, the fact that what Trump is talking about is not at all what he was asked about. He was asked about not merely, in quotation marks, about people starving. He was asked about people being murdered by starvation, which is a very different thing again. And
Yes.
not only being murdered by starvation, but murdered by others as well. And all of this with enormously strong support from the United States. Let's not forget that the United States, under all governments involved, Biden and Trump, has been a co-perpetrator of this genocide, right? If they finally acknowledge what this really is, they would actually admit their own guilt. And they would have to, if they were truthful, right? They all actually belong at the Hague, all of them, as do a lot of European politicians, right? So in terms of a debate, what can we say? I mean,
But
Trump...
there is a double down on this case, Tarik. Sorry to interrupt you. There is I noticed that there is a big backlash in the U.S. against people who say this is a genocide.
Yes.
And once the backlash happens, there are certain personalities who are doubling down on this. Like I see that there is a certain level of challenging to the prevailing narrative in the United States that Israel is our greatest ally and that we have support them as much as we can, and Israel is the only democracy in the region against the barbarians, etc. But we see there is a Christian element now coming to a talk, and this is not the Christian Zionism, but some people who say we are Christians and we don't want to see what is happening with our taxpayer money because this is directly funded by the United States. The Trump administration says, oh, we gave them $60 million humanitarian aid. But they have given billions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel to create the humanitarian catastrophe there, right? So what I wanted to say, like yesterday, Tucker, for example, posted a podcast conversation with a retired U.S. Army veteran, and they were talking about Gaza. I didn't watch that yet, but I saw the reactions on it. It seems that the Israeli lobby, to a certain extent, they are very capable, but at the same time, some of the talking heads have become too big even for the Israeli lobby to come after them and destroy them.
Look, my observation also would be that at this point, the narrative control, the enormous power of censorship and shaping public discussion that the Israel lobby has been weakened. I think it's clearly been weakened because the best indicator, in my view, is mainstream media, right? I mean, in the alternative media, what I and you are doing, for instance, people have been speaking up for a while, at least some. But it's interesting that we now see people talking more and more openly about the criminal nature of Israeli attacks on the Palestinians, genocide, extermination, collective punishment. Basically, really any war crime you can think of is being committed by Israel, right? That's really literally true. So, and crime against humanity as well. So there is a weakening of the Israel lobby's grip. They have overdone it. But I wouldn't be too optimistic too fast.
Yes.
Because I think you have to be worried about the future. Imagine, for instance, one of the things that I find very disturbing right now is that part of even the critical discourse, this new critical discourse, right, that's just woken up, right, they focus so much on the starvation blockade that one thing I could imagine in the future is a scenario where the Israelis relent a little bit and then a little bit more on that particular feature of their mass murder. And then immediately we are being asked to forgive and forget. Oh my God, yeah, that's getting better. That's fine now, right? And everything else they can still do. The problem with Israel is that it is a very long-term project. And Israelis, unfortunately, across parties have incredible continuity of agenda. They do. And so I am worried that all these people who have suddenly now discovered that there is something very bad happening in Gaza, are going to turn away the moment Israel relents a tiny little bit, because they don't understand and they don't want to see the depths of the crimes, the long-standing nature of the crimes, and the long-standing plans that the crimes are attached to, right? Let me put it very radically. Imagine a scenario, which won't happen, but imagine a scenario where Israel says, ceasefire now, we stop, food can go in, it's all over, right? I would bet with you that a lot of people would be satisfied and celebrate like idiots.
Yeah.
And they would forget that Israel is the type of state that can do this and relaunch in 3 months and start the whole thing again when we've all forgotten, right? That's the thing that Israel can easily do, right? It's not even going to do that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to predict such a scenario. What I'm trying to do is outline that people have to really come to a truly radical, fundamental critique of Israel. They have to stop looking at specific aspects of specific crimes on a specific day. And they have to understand that the whole thing is incredibly criminal and will always continue being criminal. All that they ever do is a tactical break to take a breather, or they might have a ceasefire with Iran because it got too dangerous for them, for instance. They might appease public opinion a tiny bit if they think it's getting out of hand, but they will not stop. And at this point, I have to repeat what I've said many times before, and I've really said this from the beginning of this particular genocide. I believe it will only stop if Israel is abolished as a state. Israel itself is a deeply criminal project. It's like Nazi Germany. It has to go. It has to go entirely, and it has to be replaced by Palestine. And let me repeat, for people who are listening in from who knows what kind of Staatsschutz, this is not a call for genocide. Nobody says that Israelis should be mass murdered, because I'm not a genocider. A lot of Israelis are genociders. We know this now. That's not my cup of tea. What I'm saying is, and I think more and more people begin to see this, as a state, Israel has to cease to exist.
Probably the Israelis themselves, Tarik, know that probably they have gone too far in this Gaza onslaught. So the backlash probably going to be very, very harsh also on the Israelis if this stops, you know?
But that doesn't mean they're giving up. It's the opposite, I think. And I think you're driving there too. They are now in the situation of a horrific, blood-drenched criminal. And if they give up, they have to expect consequences, right? Somewhere they know this. And that's one reason why they become even more obstinate. And that is one reason why, in the end, it will probably take a war to defeat the state and in the end abolish it, like Nazi Germany. Consider the following. I give you a rough analogy, actually, from the history of Nazi Germany, but which a lot of people don't know about. We have some very good studies of how Germans were beginning to think about the future in about 43 to 45. That is very late in the war. And the reason why these years are important is that Allied air warfare, the bombing of German cities, was getting more and more intense. So these German civilians, at this stage in the war, they're getting punishment. They're finally feeling the war themselves, right? And they also, after Stalingrad and after Kursk, these huge battles in the Soviet Union, they begin to sense, whatever the propaganda tells them, we might actually lose this thing. And from what we know from this research, they looked into opinion reports by German secret police and so on, Gestapo. What we know is that quite a lot of Germans were beginning to worry. And they were beginning to worry in terms of, they had a sense of what they had done. They did have a sense. And they were like, oh my God, if we lose this one, they're going to take terrible revenge on us. And for a lot of them, the consequence from that fear was to stick it out, right? Because we can't lose this anymore. We have been so horrible. We cannot possibly lose because we will get the punishment we deserve, right? That was their fear. In the end, they actually didn't get the punishment they would have deserved, actually, arguably. And I think that psychologically in Israel, we probably have a mix now. We have the usual incredible arrogance, which is insane, and they're indoctrinated into this, like they think they are master race or something. But we probably also have repressed fears of what will happen if the thing finally goes down.
You know, Tarik, I don't want to sound pessimistic. I don't know why I always add this pessimistic touch in my streams, and now in your conversation. I also want to say there have been other genocides in the past,
yes,
which went nowadays the perpetrators were not let's say were not held responsible, and then they have created nations over the dead bodies of other people.
Absolutely.
Therefore in this case, especially when I see these changing dynamics in the region, in the Middle East, I see that at least in the foreseeable future, just is my pessimistic opinion, this is probably not going to happen.
Depending on how you define, I don't want to be pedantic, but I do think it depends on how you define foreseeable future. I agree. I'm
in
not
my
saying
lifetime, in my lifetime, like in my as long as
Not so
my
sure.
eyes are open.
Well, you see, here's the thing about history, right? We know from history, this is empirically a fact, that sometimes it does speed up, right? If you are, say, in Europe in 1983, you cannot predict Europe in 1991 because in these few years so much happens, right? And it's massive, right? And then for at other periods, history flows as it were slowly, right? So time-wise, I'm not sure, right? But I agree with you that from the current situation, it's very difficult to see a path to the defeat and abolition of this horrific, murderous state of Israel. But I also believe, and this is not just optimism, that there is one thing that is very specific about Israel, which is it has one absolutely vital and only one absolutely vital relationship with another power, and that is with the US. So if we ever see a future in which the US either drops Israel or in which the US is in enough of a crisis not to be able to take care of Israel, then I think everything becomes possible. That's because Israel is so incredibly dependent on this one support.
Yep. Tarik, I will show quickly what's happening in Germany related also to Gaza. This is Chancellor Merz. He received more than 1,000 Anzeige or reports in just a few days. More than 1,000 criminal complaints have been received against Chancellor Friedrich Merz from the CDU since the end of last week. This was announced by the Federal Prosecutor General's office in Karlsruhe at the request of the news magazine Focus. The subject of the advertisements or the report is almost without exception Germany's role in the Middle East conflict. As an example, the magazine cited a criminal complaint reported by the local broadcaster TV Mainfranken. In it, the district chairwoman of the left, this is from the Linke, in Aschaffenburg, Selina Pfizer, accused Merz of involvement in crimes against humanity and war crimes in connection with an alleged genocide in the Gaza Strip. Their reasoning is, as a party of the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Germany has a duty to prevent, prosecute, and punish crimes against humanity and war crimes. This also includes refraining from supplying weapons to parties to a conflict or conflicting parties if these weapons could be used to commit violation of human rights. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the complaints, the Anzeige there itself, but rather how impactful is this type of legal action against, for example, someone like Friedrich Merz, and do we really have, let's say, confidence in the such a legal procedure to bring at least some sort of political pressure on the politicians in Germany to stop the supply of weapons, at least?
Look, this is my guess. Personally, of course, I think it's great that people are doing this, right? And I wished I had launched my own complaint as well. But I am still pessimistic that this in and of itself is going to be very, very effective. I think it's right to do it. But first of all, I doubt, I'm sorry to say this, but I doubt that the prosecutors in Germany, the Bundesanwaltschaft, Generalbundesanwalt is sufficiently independent to actually pursue this seriously. Secondly, I fear that Merz, of course, is going to have recourse to the same legal resources that Germany used, for instance, in the case against Nicaragua, when Nicaragua sued Germany essentially in March 2024 before the International Court of Justice, right? And unfortunately, Germany was successful in at least not blocking the case. The case is still ongoing. So the Germans didn't win the case, but they managed to contain the case because they managed to convince the judges not to use provisional measures against Germany, which was a great mistake on the part of the judges. But it tells you that, of course, in a government apparatus that like in Germany, there are a lot of very well-trained lawyers. And we all understand that lawyers can also argue very bad cases and very unjust cases forcefully when they want to, right? Or when they are given orders to do so. So on these two grounds, I would be very surprised if this would lead to a straightforward result by actually Merz being, condemned by a German court, right? Which hypothetically it's possible, but I don't think this is practically going to happen. But I still think, I know this sounds a bit lame, but I still think this is a very good signal and it's the right signal. And I hope many more people will join this type of thing. Figures also play a role here. I believe that what will stop someone like Merz is only fear. And I mean fear of consequences. Legal consequences, yes, but probably at an international level and much later. Merz doesn't have a conscience. Olaf Scholz, his predecessor, didn't have a conscience. Robert Habeck didn't have a conscience. Annalena Baerbock didn't have a conscience. Johann Wadefuhl doesn't have a conscience. And we could go on and on and on. And I'm saying this with so much certainty because they've all been tested, right? It's difficult to tell if a specific human being has a conscience or not when you observe them in everyday life. Okay, they passed a red traffic light. That doesn't tell you that much about the moral composition, right? But if humans are subjected by circumstances to the test of being bystanders to a genocide, then you will know something. And all of these people I've just enumerated have not only abstained from helping the victims, they have helped the perpetrators massively. All of them. They have all made decisions to stand on the side of the Israeli perpetrators of genocide, to lie for them, to intervene diplomatically. It was the Germans who blocked some of the first full ceasefire proposals. Those wouldn't have gone through anyhow because the Israelis would never have done it, but the Germans made extra sure at the UN, at the EU. They were not alone, but it was the Germans too. It was the Germans who took Israel's side when Israel was finally called out before the International Court of Justice by South Africa. And the Germans didn't have to do this, and they're still up to this game. It's the Germans who have been providing military equipment to Israel throughout this genocide. There is a pattern in how they've done it. They massively increased their military supplies to Israel immediately after October. So they've supplied massively right into the genocide, right? And it didn't concern them. Then the South Africans came and finally sued Israel. And then the Nicaraguans came in 24 and sued the Germans. And when you look at the way the Germans have licensed military exports to Israel, there is a pattern because they're going down for a while. Because they use that as an argument before the International Court of Justice to say, look, we are already reducing, which is, of course, fiendish and disgusting. Because, first of all, you're not supposed to deliver anything, not to reduce. And the fact that you're reducing just because you're under some legal pressure before the ICJ tells me that you know it's a crime. It tells me you know it's a crime, and it tells me that you're trying to trick your way out of it, which unfortunately the judges let them do that, right? That was their mistake. So the Germans, and we could go on, they have a horrific, the German governments, the two that have been around since the genocide started, this genocide, have a horrific track record. In history books, they will be among the worst. Next to the US, next to the UK, they will be counting among the worst accomplices of this genocide. So maybe I have a feeling that some of them are beginning to get cold feet. We've seen this even with Ursula von der Leyen, also German, if now messing up the EU. We've seen this with Merz. We've seen this with these ridiculous operations that are now beginning or talked about, like dropping pallets, to basically beat people to death on the ground instead of really doing something helpful.
Yep.
But there is no real action. You always have to remind people we are completely misconditioned by our public discourse. The UN Genocide Convention, this is the gold standard here, and it's a legal document of 1948, demands that all signatory states not only not commit the genocide, obviously, it also demands that they, I quote, prevent and punish.
Yes.
Prevent and punish.
True.
So all of these states that are helping the Israelis, they have replaced complicity with the perpetrators with the actual legal duty, which would be, first of all, massive economic warfare. That would be the bare minimum against Israel, massive economic warfare. And the second would be military intervention. Yes, military intervention against Israel is actually the duty of every state that has signed the UN 1948 Genocide Convention. That's literally true. It's just been buried. And the Germans are miles away from that.
Guys, before we jump to the second half of today's conversation, I would like to thank our dear friend Red Access for moderating the live chat always professionally and respectfully with everyone. I really appreciate his efforts. I would like to bring your attention now to a recent article which our dear friend Tarik has published on his Substack. I will first post a link now in the live chat, and this link is also copied in the description below. And what is this link about, guys? It's a special offer from Tarik for the audience of Syriana Analysis, which means if you're watching now Syriana Analysis and you're following this show, which is called Cold War 2.0, we do this weekly every Friday at 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Those who are watching this, they have the opportunity to click on this link in the description below, and this is 20% off on the new annual subscriptions, those who subscribe to Tarik's Substack. And this offer is valid today, the 1st of August, and tomorrow, the 2nd of August, around 30 hours left. So if you just click and you want and wish to follow Tarik's work and subscribe to his work, then you will get a 20% deduction because you are watching this show. So it's a win-win for everyone. If you are interested in reading his analysis, which we're going to do at the current moment because he has published today, I think this was yesterday, the geopolitics of assisted suicide. And Tarik says in history, some things become clear only in hindsight. For instance, German unification all over again. Good thing or bad thing? That jury is still out. At this point, it looks as if we will soon look back with regrets from yet another very bleak post-war situation to ponder that question. But there are also things that are obvious from the moment they start happening. For example, Israel's and West's Gaza genocide. No matter that many talking heads now pretend they have only just noticed. Something else that is as in your face obvious as a concrete wall we have just run into is that the EU has just suffered a catastrophic, crippling defeat. As usual, with America's European vassals, the defeat is strange. I would like to hear the premise of this article, Tarik. Why do you call this the geopolitics of assisted suicide? What a title that you found for this article.
a key role, right? What the article is about is the recent agreement, if you want to call it that, between the United States on one side and the EU on the other side. It's true that the agreement is still a little bit up in the air, right? But the initial shape it took, at least at Turnberry, at Trump's golf resort in Scotland, is a horrific defeat for the EU because it's a completely one-sided non-deal. In essence, the Europeans are giving various things, and they're all very costly. And the US is giving strictly nothing, like literally nothing, which is striking. There isn't even anything face-saving in this deal. It's like a real nothing, right? They've been slapped in the face. And the person who is most, if there's one single person, there are of course many involved, but the one single person most involved in this on the European side is of course the head of the Commission of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, who some people may know by training is actually a medical doctor, right? By training. And, once you think about that, it's almost like she's helping Europe she's helping Europe now to commit suicide. She really is. Because what this non-deal amounts to is total capitulation and ongoing economic warfare by the United States against its own European clients, or I would call them vassals. The point about US empire right now, and of course there is a US empire, right, is that it has become not only highly domineering, it's always been that, of course, it's an empire, that's what they do. But there's something rather unusual, which is that it is now devouring. It's devouring its periphery. Even its allies, so-called allies, are now being razed and devastated. And this is happening to Europe. Europe, however, if you think about it, has, run down as it is, with all its problems, it has the demographic and economic weight to actually resist. Europe could resist, like China can resist. They're very different. China is much more sovereign. It's true. China hasn't got American bases all over it. China just has them around it, right? China has the Chinese leadership has a much clearer understanding of what it wants from the world and what it's not ready to go along with. I understand the difference. But the basic facts, the fundamental data in both cases are, these are very large entities with still large economies, right? Chinese economy is basically booming with problems, but booming. The European economy is not booming, but it's large, right? So both of these entities, if they only want to, if they found the political will, could resist. They could. Yeah. All the more so that the obvious path for the European Union to resist this cannibalization by the American empire now would be to balance by building relationships with China and Russia. That's what you would expect, right? If you think in terms of classical realism, if you think of the EU as a realist player trying to pursue its interests in the international realm, it would have been building good relationships with China and Russia for a while to balance against the US. That doesn't mean entering into direct conflict with the US. It means precisely that, balance, create a situation in which the US can't impose its will, right? In which you have leverage. And what we're seeing is that the EU behaves like an entity that has zero leverage, which is unusual. Now, let me make one last point, which is, I know I must have mentioned this before somewhere, but one of the great authorities of the school of realism, right, in international relations is, of course, John Mearsheimer, right? Yeah. And he was once challenged in an interview. I saw it myself. And he was asked, look, you're saying states usually behave according to what you can define as national interests. Those are pursued rationally. But look at the way in which the United States supports Israel to its own detriment in international politics. And you know what Mearsheimer said? He said, you're right. That is an actual exception. That is an exception to my theory. And he rightly said, no theory holds everywhere. That's normal, right? A theory has to hold for a lot of cases to be worth anything. But if somebody tells you his theory always holds, that's not believable. And he admitted that's an exception. There's something wrong.
That's why it's a theory.
Yes, but of course, Mearsheimer is also the co-author of a book about the Israel lobby. So he, in essence, I think what he was saying, this is a very strange case in which a lobby has managed to actually make a government not pursue the national interest against realist theory. And then you look at somebody like Ursula von der Leyen. And if you think about the EU as the combined national interests of its 27 European members, she's definitely not pursuing those. She's pursuing the interest of the US. No, literally. And I repeat what I said before, I'm not saying she is a paid up agent, although I wouldn't exclude anything anymore in this world. I'm not saying she's a traitor, although objectively a lot of people may say it's very hard to distinguish what she is doing from what a traitor would be doing. But I am saying the pattern of her behavior is actually serving the US and not the EU, although she is the head of the European Union Commission. There are many more things to be said about this, but I don't want to go on forever, right?
I mean, if we read a little bit about the corruption case of Ursula von der Leyen with the vaccine companies, we understand the depth of the corruption in the EU and herself, and how she could be blackmailed or compromised or
Yes, the potential is there. And it's not just Pfizergate, it's the swirling corruption about her and actually her family. You know, when you look into the business interests of her husband, which gets very interesting as well. Wow. So again, I'm making no assertions, but I would say that empirically, it's inexplicable how anybody can claim to negotiate for the European Union and walk away with this type of so-called deal, right? And there's a reason, if I may add one thing, as you read out, you said it's a strange defeat, right? There's a reason why I wrote strange defeat, because it's an allusion to a famous book about the defeat of France, the title of a famous book about the defeat of France by the Germans in 1940, L'étrange défaite, by a historian, Marc Bloch, who later became a member of the resistance, and the Germans murdered him for that, right? But what Bloch was getting at with this title was, it's really hard to explain how this happened. We had a large army, we had tanks. How could we be defeated like that? Right? In 6 weeks, how could they just wipe the floor with us like this? And of course, there was an element of asking, well, did we do something to ourselves? Yeah. Were there members of our elites that did something to us? Did something happen inside our country? And yeah, it's a strange defeat what the EU has just suffered. It's really bizarre because it's a full capitulation. It's unconditional capitulation without a fight.
And it didn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this way.
No. In fact, there's a really interesting article. I'm sure there are more. That's the one that comes to my mind. There's a very interesting article the Financial Times published about 5 days ago or something like that, if somebody wants to look it up. And it's a detailed account of all the things that the EU could have done. And it's also a detailed account of how they know about this, how they're thinking about this, how they're making plans since Trump's so-called Liberation Day, right? It's all there. They're thinking about it. They know they have options. And then in the end, they come out and use absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
What is this?
Yeah. By the way, we're going to stay in Europe, by the way, guys. The next one is going to be more hot topic, which is nuclear. And before that, if you notice, I'm looking here all the time. I just want to show you what's going on next to me. I don't know if you can see. But he is literally here and looking for attention from me. So sometimes I have to look, and now he slips next to me. So he needs to go out. But we will continue. We still have 18 minutes for this stream. Tarik, according to reports coming from the Bloomberg, I will show this report to the screen. The US has likely moved nuclear weapons to the UK, which is the first time since 2008. The US has likely stationed nuclear weapons in the UK for the first time since 2008 in a signal to Russian President Vladimir Putin that it remains committed to European security. On July 16th, a US military aircraft flew with its transponder on, making its identification and location publicly visible. From a US nuclear weapon depot in New Mexico to an airbase in the UK city of Lakenheath or Heath. The weapons the aircraft most likely delivered were the new B-61/12 thermonuclear bombs, increasing the number of US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe for the first time since the Cold War. Albrecht, who is William Albrecht, is a Europe-based senior fellow at the Pacific Forum, said the decision to leave the flight transponders on indicates the US wants to show Russia that it is not reducing its nuclear capability in Europe. NATO officials declined to immediately comment. What could such nuclear weapons bring to Europe in terms of security and its geopolitical struggle with Russia? What risks does it also bring? So we have, of course, some of it is for defense purposes, some of which will definitely bring more security risks. And why the deployment in the UK? I think this is also important to address.
Yeah, look, these weapons are, maybe one should first say what they more or less are, right? They're gravity bombs. In other words, in some ways, they're very classical bombs. They're bombs that you drop from a plane over the target and they just fall down. They have some gimmicks attached to them. You can guide them a little bit and stuff, but they're not missiles. They're essentially gravity bombs, right? So in that sense, they're something very old and very primitive. Of course, there are very modern versions of this. They're also scalable in the nuclear yield. So you can actually switch the nuclear deal. You can dial it up, yield. You can dial it up and down on an individual weapon, right? It's a very strange concept, but you can. Obviously, they're still devastating. They're nuclear weapons, right? They're considered comparatively small, small, but they're still devastating. They're nuclear weapons. So it's really strange, to be honest, because the United Kingdom, of course, has nuclear deterrence of its own, right? Unlike, say, Germany or Belgium or the Netherlands or Italy, the United Kingdom actually has its own nuclear weapons, right? And there are several hundred warheads. I've forgotten the exact number, but maybe it's 200, 250, whatever. They used to have planes that had the ability to deliver nuclear weapons from the air, and that stopped a long time ago. I can't quite remember when. And since then, UK, British nuclear deterrence is entirely submarine-based. So these are the submarines that are sort of diving around in the oceans of the world. Nobody is supposed to know where they are, and they are sort of a last insurance policy, because they're there to signal to a potential attacker that you may take us out, but you will never find these submarines. And the last thing we do, we will drag you with us down. You will all die because our submarines will then devastate you. That's what nuclear subs are for, right?
Yeah.
They're not so much, they're weapons of very last resort, right? There are, in that sense, the UK has its nuclear deterrence. So you have to ask, why does the UK need these gravity bombs in addition, which is a very different capacity? What is so scary about these weapons that are called tactical nuclear weapons is that that's the type of weapon that some and far too many politicians and military planners think may be usable without ending the world, may be usable without ending the whole world, right? So if you launch, say, 50 intercontinental missiles, right, from the United States against Russia, you know that the response will be devastating. Probably China will join in, probably the planet will go up in flames. That's that type of nuclear attack. If you are insane enough to think that you can wage war with nuclear weapons at a lower scale, right, where you use one here, one there, it gives you an advantage, but the world doesn't end. You can still win. You can win a nuclear war. The weapons you are interested in are precisely these types of tactical, so-called tactical nuclear weapons. That's what one has to understand. And the big story here for me is that the Europeans, and this is very much in line with how they have been behaving recently, namely self-destructively. The Europeans are accepting the Americans giving them a type of nuclear weapon that allows for a limited, in quotation marks, limited nuclear war in Europe.
Wow.
Right? So this opens a scenario. If America is not America as such, but the American political establishment is one of the most evil forces in the world, I believe. Next to Israel, one of the worst. And this opens a perspective, and you can be absolutely sure that in Washington they know this and they are thinking about this, of having a very bad war, right, conventional and nuclear, but restricted to Europe and Russia. So look at it with the eyes of somebody very evil in the United States, right? There will be a devastating payback from the Russians, but all the nuclear weapons will be actually launched from European bases. So the Russians in this war will be sitting there with a dilemma, and they will be knowing ultimately the US is behind this. But if we strike at the US, then the US will enter with all its force, including its intercontinental missiles. So then we are dead, entirely dead, all of us. We'll have the pleasure of taking them with us, but we are all dead.
Wow.
So the Russians might choose to only, in quotation marks, retaliate against the UK, against Germany, against France, against Italy, right? What happens in the end? The Europeans are dead. They are gone. They have a very small continent. It's not even a continent. It's a piece of a continent, to be honest. And Russia would at least be massively weakened. So I believe the last thing the Europeans should accept from the United States is tactical nuclear weapons.
Wow.
The last thing. But it's true to form right now. Europe is self-destructive. They do anything to obey the United States to the point of massive self-harm. They do it in economics, they do it in security, they do it in foreign policy, where it would make sense for them to normalize with Russia and to build good relationships with China. They do the opposite.
But Ursula von der Leyen said she will never go back to relations with Russia.
Insane.
And she says that the liquefied natural gas is cheaper from the United States, which is factually incorrect and even logically a fallacy. Transporting the gas through the oceans compared to the pipeline, it's like
and the Earth is flat, you know. I mean, but there's nothing to discuss here. These people are running the show, you know. I mean,
I don't even know if she really like believes that, or she thinks people are stupid, or and I'm not saying that she must, because everybody has the right to choose whatever gas energy wants them to buy. It's their decision at the end, but you can't sell it from this angle and say, oh, but the liquefied natural gas from the United States is cheaper. It's not. Sorry.
You know, to be honest, I would even carp a little bit with everybody has the right, because I agree with you. Everybody has the right. And for me, that actually means national governments. I think it's all EU overreach to shut this down like this. I think the national governments should retain the right inside the EU to make their own energy policy. I think all of this common EU policy is a massive power grab. But that's the EU for you. After all, that's what it was built for.
I totally agree. And by the way, since we're speaking about this nuclear issue in the UK, there is another interesting article this week published, and this time in the British press. They're talking about, in the Telegraph, Britain ready to fight over Taiwan. Defense Secretary suggests Britain is ready to fight in the Pacific if conflict breaks out over Taiwan. The Defense Secretary has suggested. John Healey was speaking on board the HMS Prince of Wales alongside Richard Marles, Australia's Deputy Prime Minister, as the ship docked in Darwin to join war games with allies, including the US. Asked by the Telegraph about what the UK is doing to help countries like Taiwan to prepare for potential escalation for China, Mr. Healey, he said this, just let me highlight it. If we have to fight, as we have done in the past, Australia and the UK are nations that will fight together. We exercise together, and by exercising together and being more ready to fight, we deter better together. He added, we secure peace through strength, and our strength comes from our allies. Now, I know this is a serious issue, but the other day I saw a commentary from a journalist saying, basically, the UK has more think tanks to fire on China than actual missiles.
Look, I mean, you remember that old Bond movie, Tomorrow Never Dies or something? It's really very old. It's not a good one, by the way. I mean, they're all crap, right? But some of them are not as bad as others. And that the premise of this movie is the possibility of a fight between the UK and China, right? And of course, even then, you were looking at this and we were like, no, that's not even a possibility. That's not a fight. You know, I'm sorry, but the UK against China, the UK is gone. I'm sorry. That will be over very quickly. This is not Argentina, right? I'm sorry. This is not the Falklands. So, and even that they could only win because the Americans, of course, massively supported them. So it's very odd, this whole behavior. I think personally, and I have great sympathy for Great Britain. I've lived there for 4 years. I got my BA there and my MSc. But still, I think that there really is a phantom pain in the British establishment, and that's about the empire, right? They still haven't been able to really rethink themselves as a middle power, as a real middle power, as not so special.
They couldn't swallow it.
No, they can't. And in fact, it's always interesting for me as somebody who also does Russian history. Originally, I'm a Russianist, right? And a Ukrainianist, which is great fun together now. As a Russian, it's always been very interesting to me that with Russia, a lot of Western observers are very fast, they're very quick to say, oh, this Russian behavior has to do with the fact that they still think of themselves as an empire, right? They have this lag. I'm sorry, have you ever looked at the UK? The whole thing consists of that, right? They haven't come clean with the loss of their empire ever. I mean, it's not that uncommon. And I would say the Russians have actually processed that much better by now and more quickly. But that's a different issue. So Taiwan, right? One should say a few things about Taiwan, which of course the Telegraph doesn't mention. Under international law, which even the Americans recognize, Taiwan is actually a part of China. Even the Americans, if you drive them into a corner, still recognize that legally Taiwan is a province of China, right? So all of these belligerent statements of how they're going to fight over Taiwan is basically telling China that we are ready to fight with you over one of your provinces, because that's what it would be, right? Now, the complication is, of course, that Taiwan is a province that de facto has gone its own way, and that was an outcome of the Civil War and the Cold War. If the Civil War in 1949 in China hadn't ended when the Cold War was actually really sort of exploding, then maybe the Chinese of Beijing and of the mainland would have reconquered Taiwan much more quickly, right? But it very quickly became a Cold War outpost for, the Americans and the West in general. So Taiwan, in this very specific situation, has had its own political history, as if it were a state of its own. And I'm not being cynical here. I can imagine that there are a lot of Taiwanese people who very honestly and for their own good reasons say, yeah, we are sort of a state of our own, and we don't want to just be pushed around by the mainland Chinese. Fine, fair. But the problem is, ultimately, this is a problem between different Chinese. This is a problem between Taiwan and mainland China. And the way that the West has weaponized it and is turning it into this sort of trap for China, where, we can finally fight the big war to inflict probably a strategic defeat on China. That's what they dream of, right, over Taiwan. That is the West's fault, of course. What the West should be doing is incentivize both sides to remain peaceful, whatever else they do, not to start shooting at each other. That would always be a tragedy. But the West is not doing that. No longer, definitely no longer. What the West is doing now is provoking China.
True.
And I think that even as a policy of trying to keep Taiwan, I'm not saying they are doing this yet at an acute level, but I'm thinking they're keeping it ready. They're sort of keeping it prepared for the possibility of initiating a war with China. Because nobody in the West would admit that. They would always say the only way this could start is if mainland China actually tries to solve the problem by force and invades across the Taiwan Strait. But we know that the starting of wars is not that simple. I mean, it is entirely conceivable that, as with the famous Tonkin incident, right, during the Vietnam Wars, you could also have a fabricated incident in the Taiwan Straits
100%.
if somebody in Washington really wants that. Easy.
And this is the expertise of the UK. Believe me, this type of
Yes.
false flag
Oh yeah,
operations.
MI6 would love to take part in that. Absolutely.
It's like they do courses about this.
Yeah, they can outsource it to them. Yes, yes, yeah.
Wow.
So this is terrible. You know what my great hope is, and I'm sure you think the same. My hope is that whatever the people on Taiwan itself do, and however they see their relationship with the mainland, which is really something to figure out between them and the mainland.
Yep.
But my hope is that whatever they do, that they don't allow themselves to be turned into pawns, as happened
100%.
to the Ukrainians. The Taiwanese need to look at Ukraine and learn the lesson of Ukraine. Do not be Ukraine.
100%. And this is the same message I always send to my compatriots or countrymen or others. For example, in Armenia, don't become a pawn. I'm not telling you to become pro-Russia. I'm not telling you to become pro-BRICS, pro-China, but don't be a pawn in anyone's hand, neither Russia nor China, and nor the EU or the transatlantic. So when I push against, like when I see Armenia is moving towards becoming a pawn for this transatlantic alliance, people say you're peddling pro-Kremlin talking points, and all I want is for this country to diversify its relationship, to have good relationship with the East and the West, and bear the fruits of this relationship, because you're a small country, like Taiwan is a small island, Armenia is a small country, and you could be smashed in this big geopolitical game. Ukraine is one of the largest militaries in Europe, and see what happened there in front of your eyes. Therefore, when we warn, our warning comes from the position of people who really care about human life. These people in charge, Tarik mentioned this many times, they're psychopaths. They don't even they have no feelings, they have no empathy, they have no sympathy to people who die in mass, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. They don't care. So all we are asking you through this conversation, from wherever you're watching, guys, like your country, your nation, you should preserve it, and this country shouldn't be in any sort of a geopolitical position that could be used against another party. You have your own country, you have your own interest, and especially in cases like Taiwan and China, I think this should be, as our dear friend Tarik said, should be solved among the people in Taiwan and in China. This is a domestic issue. Once it becomes a foreign issue, geopolitical issue, it becomes like a fire in fuel on fire. So that's what we don't want, actually. Tarik, my friend, thank you so much for your great insights always. Just to remind our dear followers, first of all, to thank them all with hundreds. They have watched today's episode, our live show. Tarik's Substack, for you guys, if you want to subscribe, you have a special link in the description below. If you click it today or tomorrow, only for the followers of Syriana Analysis, those who are watching this stream, they can receive 20% off on Tarik's Substack and his paid articles. And for those who like to support this show, the easy thing to do is just hit the like button, subscribe to this YouTube channel. And if you like to do more and support this independent channel, there are different means in the description below. And I will see you on Monday. And we will see you again next Friday at the same time, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. So peace be upon you, upon your families, and peace be upon you, Red Access, for being a great moderator of the live chat. And I will see you soon. Salam.
Thank you.